Put the fishing rod down. You're not allowed to fish here anymore. Those were the first words I heard before I saw the HOA violation notice in her hand. And the strangest part was that I was standing on my own dock, on my own land, looking at my own lake. The morning air smelled like wet cedar and fresh rain. The surface of the water was perfectly still, reflecting the orange glow of the sunrise over the pine trees that surrounded my 38-acre property in northern Georgia. I could hear the soft splash of water against the wooden posts beneath my boots and the quiet hum of my old pickup truck cooling down behind me. It was the kind of morning my grandfather spent his entire life protecting. Then Victoria Harrington arrived. Silver Creek Estates, HOA president. Clipboard in one hand, $825 fine notice in the other. She stepped onto the gravel path like she owned every inch of ground beneath her designer boots. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, with that polite smile people use when they have already decided they are right. "This community lake is reserved for approved residents and registered activities." I looked at the paper she handed me. Violation, unauthorized fishing. Location, Silver Creek Community Lake. Fine, $825. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the words were so completely disconnected from reality. My grandfather built that dock himself in 1974. I still remembered the smell of the old wood and the sound of his hammer hitting the boards when I was a kid. He taught me how to read the water, how to respect the land, and how to never take something that did not belong to me. What he never expected was that someone would try to take something that did belong to us. My name is Nathan Caldwell. I'm 41 years old, and for most of my life, I studied freshwater ecosystems, helping communities protect lakes and rivers across the country. But this lake was different. This wasn't just another body of water on a map. This was where my family gathered every summer. This was where my grandfather taught me patience. This was where I learned that ownership wasn't about putting up signs or making rules. It was about responsibility. Victoria looked across the lake and pointed toward the far shoreline. "The HOA has managed this property for years," she said. "Everyone understands that. Everyone except me. Because I knew something she didn't. Something hidden in old records, forgotten documents, and a piece of family history sitting in a metal box in my grandfather's workshop. She believed she was enforcing a rule. She had no idea she was stepping into a property dispute she could never win. At that moment, I simply folded the notice, placed it in my jacket pocket, and looked back at the water. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just smiled. Because Victoria Harrington had made one very expensive mistake. She assumed the person standing quietly by the lake was the person with the least power. She was about to learn that the water she claimed to control had never belonged to the HOA at all. The next morning, I walked through my grandfather's old workshop before sunrise, and the smell of cedar, dust, and machine oil brought me back to a time when life felt a lot simpler. The small building sat about 50 yards from the lake, with the same faded green door, the same wooden shelves, and the same worn workbench where my grandfather spent countless hours repairing fishing reels and building tools. Every scratch on that bench had a story. I could still see the marks left behind from decades of honest work. My grandfather, Walter Caldwell, was not a wealthy man. He was a carpenter who believed that anything worth having was worth protecting. He bought the land in 1974 when the area was mostly forest and farmland. Back then, there were no fancy neighborhoods, no decorative entrance signs, and no community meetings deciding what people could or could not do on their own property. There was just the land, the lake, and a family grateful to have a place to call home. When I was a kid, summers meant waking up before the heat settled in, grabbing a fishing pole, and walking down the same gravel path I walked yesterday when Victoria Harrington handed me that ridiculous fine. My grandfather would sit beside me on the dock and tell me that land was more than dirt. It was a responsibility passed from one generation to the next. I never forgot that. After he passed away, I inherited the property and spent years maintaining it. I repaired the dock, cleared fallen branches after storms, tested the water quality, and protected the natural environment around the lake. My career as a freshwater biologist taught me something important. Water remembers everything. It records changes. It shows when people respect nature and when they do not. That was one reason I immediately knew something was wrong when the Silver Creek community began treating my lake like a public attraction. The first time I noticed the changes was about 3 years earlier. New signs appeared near the road. New trails were cut through the trees. People I had never met started walking along the shoreline. At first, I assumed they were just neighbors exploring the area. Then I saw something that caught my attention. A small sign near the entrance mentioned access rules created by the Silver Creek Homeowners Association. I remember standing there, holding a cup of coffee, reading those words while the morning fog floated above the water. Something about it felt wrong. I checked my property records, but I did not find anything unusual at the time. The paperwork was old, and some of the documents were stored away in places I had not looked through in years. I decided not to start a fight without knowing the facts. That was always how my grandfather handled problems. Gather information. Stay calm. Let the truth speak for itself. What I did not know was that Victoria Harrington had already convinced herself that the lake belonged to her community. She had spent years making decisions based on assumptions instead of facts. And the more people accepted those assumptions, the stronger her confidence became. But confidence built on a mistake eventually collapses. I just did not realize yet how much that mistake would cost her. The first real confrontation with Victoria Harrington happened 2 weeks after I found those new signs around the lake. I was standing near the shoreline, checking the water quality samples I collected every month, when I heard the sound of tires rolling over gravel behind me. The crunch of stones stopped, and a white luxury SUV parked beside the old oak tree at the edge of my property. The door opened, and Victoria stepped out carrying the same leather clipboard she seemed to treat like a badge of authority. She looked around my land as if she was inspecting a place that belonged to someone else. "Nathan," she said, walking toward me with a calm expression, "we need to discuss your continued use of the lake." I remember looking at the water behind her. The morning sun was reflecting across the surface, and the only sound was the gentle movement of waves against the dock. It was peaceful, until she spoke again. "The Silver Creek Homeowners Association has designated this area as a community recreational space. Fishing, boating, and shoreline activities require approval." I looked at her for a moment because I honestly thought I had misunderstood. "A community recreational space?" I asked. "Victoria, this lake is on my property." She gave a small smile, the kind people use when they believe they are explaining something obvious to someone who does not understand. "Nathan, we have managed this area for years. The residents expect access. The rules are already established." That was the moment I realized this was not a simple misunderstanding. Victoria was not asking a question. She was making a claim. She had convinced herself that because the neighborhood had grown around my land, she somehow gained control over it. I had seen this happen before in my work. People become comfortable with a system, and eventually they forget to ask whether the system is actually built on the right foundation. Over the next few weeks, the pressure increased. The Silver Creek Homeowners Association sent letters reminding me about community standards. They posted additional signs near the walking paths. They even created a schedule for lake access without ever speaking to me. Every document had the same polished language, the same professional formatting, and the same hidden message. They wanted me to believe they had authority. One afternoon, I attended a neighborhood meeting because I wanted to clear everything up before it went any further. The community center smelled like fresh coffee and printed paper. Folding chairs filled the room, and residents whispered quietly while Victoria stood at the front with a presentation about protecting property values. When my name came up, she described me as a property owner who was resisting community cooperation. Those words stayed with me. Resisting cooperation. That was how she framed it. Not defending my property. Not protecting my family's land. Just resisting. I looked around the room and saw people who had only heard one side of the story. They trusted the person holding the microphone because she sounded confident. But confidence does not replace facts. I decided not to argue that night. I simply listened. I took notes. I watched every detail. The dates on the documents. The wording she used. The assumptions she made. Because every time Victoria spoke, she revealed a little more about what she believed. And every mistake she made was another piece of information I could use later. She still thought this was about a fishing rule. She had no idea she was building a case for the one person who actually had the records to prove who owned the water. The moment I realized Victoria Harrington was not going to stop was the morning I found a bright orange notice attached to the old wooden gate leading to my lake. The paper moved slightly in the breeze, making a soft snapping sound against the weathered boards. I remember standing there with my coffee in one hand and the notice in the other, feeling the cold morning air against my face. The smell of wet leaves and pine trees surrounded me, the same familiar scent I had known since childhood. But that morning, my family property felt different. It felt like someone was trying to rewrite its history. The notice was not just another reminder. It was a warning. The Silver Creek Homeowners Association had issued another violation against me. This time, the reason was not only fishing. They claimed I had failed to comply with community recreation rules, and they added another fine on top of the original $825. I stared at the words for a long time. They were written in perfect legal language, designed to make ordinary people feel like they had already lost. That was Victoria's strategy. She did not need to raise her voice. She used paperwork. She used confidence. She used the assumption that most people would simply give up. But I had spent my entire career studying water systems, and one thing I learned was that small cracks eventually reveal bigger problems. I started looking deeper. I went back through every letter, every email, and every document the Homeowners Association had sent me. I placed them across my grandfather's old workbench, the same bench where he used to repair tools after long days outside. The wood still carried the marks of decades of use. I ran my hand across the surface and remembered his advice. Never argue with someone who already made up their mind. Let the facts do the talking. So I stayed quiet. I watched. I collected everything. I noticed that every document from Victoria used the phrase community lake, but none of them included an actual property record proving it. I noticed that the signs around the lake appeared after the Homeowners Association started promoting the area as a neighborhood attraction. I noticed that every decision came from Victoria, but every responsibility somehow ended up on everyone else. Then came the day she pushed too far. I received a letter informing me that my access to the dock would be restricted until I completed a compliance review with the Homeowners Association Board. My own dock. The dock my grandfather built with his own hands. The dock where I spent countless mornings learning everything I knew about the water. I read that letter twice, then placed it beside the others. I did not feel angry. I felt focused. Because by then, I understood something important. Victoria was not protecting the neighborhood. She was protecting an idea she had created in her own mind. She believed that if she controlled the signs, the meetings, and the paperwork, she controlled the truth. But truth does not disappear because someone prints it on official-looking paper. That evening, I walked down to the lake as the sun disappeared behind the trees. The water was calm. The old dock creaked beneath my boots. I looked across the shoreline and thought about how long this had been happening without anyone questioning it. Victoria believed she had built an empire around that lake. She did not know that the foundation of that empire was about to be tested by the one thing she never expected me to have: the original records. For the first time in weeks, I stopped trying to convince Victoria Harrington that she was wrong. I stopped attending meetings where she repeated the same polished statements. I stopped responding to letters that were written to make me feel like I was already defeated. Instead, I started searching for the one thing that mattered most: proof. The old records were somewhere. I knew that. My grandfather never threw away important documents. He kept everything organized, even if his filing system looked confusing to anyone else. The problem was that after he passed away, the property changed hands so quickly that I focused on maintaining the land instead of reviewing every piece of paperwork. That changed the night I sat alone in his workshop with a flashlight, surrounded by old boxes covered in dust. The room smelled like aged wood and machine oil. Outside, rain tapped against the windows, creating the same steady rhythm I remembered from my childhood. I opened one box after another. Tax records, maintenance receipts, old photographs, handwritten notes. Every piece told a story about the land, but none of them gave me the answer I needed. Then, near midnight, I found a small metal storage case underneath a stack of old surveying equipment. The case was heavier than it looked. I wiped away the dust and noticed my grandfather's handwriting on the top. Property records. I remember sitting there for a moment, just looking at those words. My heart started beating faster, not because I knew what was inside, but because I knew my grandfather would not have saved something unless it mattered. Inside were documents carefully wrapped in protective paper. Original maps. Old county records. Survey information from when the property was purchased. I spread everything across the workbench and studied every detail. The first few pages confirmed what I already knew. My family had owned the land for decades, but then I found something that changed everything. A survey map from 1974 showed the exact boundaries of the property. I followed the lines with my finger, tracing the edge of the land, the tree line, the access road, and finally the lake. The water was not marked as a shared community feature. It was included inside the original property boundaries. I checked it again. Then I checked it a third time. The lake was ours. Not partially. Not temporarily. Completely. I sat back in my grandfather's old chair and looked around the workshop. All those years, I thought I was protecting a piece of family history. I never realized I was also protecting something Victoria had been trying to claim without permission. The next morning, I contacted a property attorney who specialized in land disputes. I brought every document, every violation notice, and every letter from the homeowners association. He carefully reviewed everything while I sat across from him, waiting for an answer. After several minutes, he looked up and said something I will never forget. "Nathan, the homeowners association may have been enforcing rules around the lake, but these documents suggest they never had authority over the water itself." That was the confirmation I needed. Victoria had built her entire argument on an assumption. She believed that because the lake was near her community, it belonged to her community. But property lines do not change because someone creates a new neighborhood sign. Rules do not override ownership, and confidence does not replace facts. I drove home that afternoon with copies of the documents sitting on the passenger seat beside me. The same road that felt heavy a few weeks earlier suddenly felt different. For the first time since Victoria handed me that $825 fine, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I was not going to fight her with anger. I was going to let the truth speak in a language she understood. Paper, records, and undeniable facts. The following week was the quietest week of the entire fight, but it was also the moment everything started changing. I stopped looking at Victoria Harrington as someone I needed to convince. I started seeing her as someone who had created a story so many times that she believed it was reality. The difference was simple. Stories can be changed. Records cannot. I spent those days organizing everything on my grandfather's old workbench. The room smelled like paper, cedar, and the faint trace of the wood polish he used every month. I placed the original survey map beside the homeowners association letters, the violation notices, and the photographs of the signs they installed around the lake. Every piece connected to the next. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Victoria had not discovered a community lake. She had created one. The first thing I did was request official copies of county property records. I wanted everything verified by a source outside my own family files. I drove to the county records office early in the morning, carrying a folder that had become heavier with every document I added. The building smelled like old paper and coffee. People quietly moved between filing cabinets and computers while I waited for the clerk to review the property information. After several minutes, she looked at the screen, then looked at the documents I brought with me. "This property boundary has not changed," she said. "The lake is included within the original parcel." Hearing those words felt different from reading them on paper. It was confirmation that the truth had been there all along. I returned home and started building a complete timeline. I documented every notice from the Silver Creek Homeowners Association. Every date, every statement, every claim that suggested they controlled something they did not own. I also reviewed the signs they placed near the water. They were carefully designed to look official. They used the same colors as their community materials. They had rules listed underneath a bold heading that made visitors assume the association had authority. But there was one problem. The authority was never there. The more I looked, the more questions appeared. Why had no one checked the original property records? Why had residents accepted these rules without seeing proof? Why was Victoria so confident that nobody would challenge her? Then I found another detail that made the situation even clearer. The Homeowners Association had collected fees related to lake activities from residents for years. They charged for events, access passes, and recreational programs connected to the water. They were not only controlling the lake, they were building an entire system around something they did not own. I sat at my kitchen table that evening with the documents spread out in front of me. The house was quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the trees near the shoreline, and I could hear the water gently touching the dock. I thought about my grandfather. He never liked unnecessary arguments. He always believed the strongest answer was the one supported by facts. That was exactly what I planned to do. The next morning, I prepared a formal response to the homeowners association. I included copies of the property records, the survey information, and the documentation showing the lake was part of my private parcel. I did not threaten anyone. I did not make accusations. I simply stated the facts. The same facts Victoria had ignored for years. When I placed the envelope in the mailbox, I knew things were about to change. Victoria still believed she was dealing with a homeowner who was finally giving up. She did not realize I had spent weeks doing the one thing she never expected. I had stopped defending myself and started proving the truth. The morning after I sent the letter to the Silver Creek Homeowners Association, I expected silence. What I did not expect was a response waiting for me before I even finished my first cup of coffee. The envelope was sitting in my mailbox, perfectly clean, with the association logo printed across the front. The paper felt thick between my fingers, the kind of expensive paper designed to make ordinary words feel more powerful than they actually are. I opened it at my kitchen table while sunlight came through the windows facing the lake. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room, but my attention was locked on the letter in front of me. Victoria Harrington had received my documents. She had seen the survey map. She had seen the county records. And instead of acknowledging the mistake, she doubled down. The letter stated that the Homeowners Association rejected my claim and would continue enforcing community regulations regarding the lake. I read that sentence 3 times. They were not questioning the documents. They were ignoring them. That was when I understood this was no longer about confusion. This was about control. Victoria had spent years creating a system where everyone assumed she was right because she spoke with confidence. She had meetings. She had official-looking forms. She had a title. But none of those things could change a property boundary. Later that afternoon, I walked down to the lake with the letter in my hand. The wind moved through the trees, and the surface of the water reflected the gray clouds above. I stood on the same dock where my grandfather taught me how to fish when I was 8 years old. I remembered his words clearly. Never let someone convince you that something belongs to them just because they say it louder. At the time, I thought he was talking about life in general. I never imagined those words would become something I needed years later. I decided my next move would not be another argument with Victoria. It would be a complete record of everything that happened. I created a timeline starting with the first unauthorized signs, followed by the lake access rules, the violation notices, the fines, and every statement made by the Homeowners Association. I saved emails. I copied letters. I photographed every sign placed around the property. I wanted every detail documented, not because I wanted a fight, but because I knew facts mattered more than opinions. A few days later, I received a call from Victoria requesting a private meeting. Her voice sounded different this time, still confident, but less certain than before. She asked me to find a reasonable solution and suggested that we could avoid unnecessary conflict if I simply accepted the association's authority over the lake. I listened quietly. Then I asked one question. Can you show me the document that gives the Homeowners Association ownership or control over this water? There was a pause, a long one. For the first time, Victoria did not immediately have an answer. She mentioned history. She mentioned community expectations. She mentioned what residents believed. But she never mentioned a deed. She never mentioned a legal transfer. She never mentioned actual ownership. And that silence told me everything I needed to know. Victoria was not protecting a right. She was protecting an assumption. The next step was clear. I was going to bring the truth to the place where assumptions stopped matching and records became the only thing that counted. The same lake that started this conflict was about to reveal exactly who had been telling the truth all along. The meeting room at the Silver Creek Community Center had never felt smaller. I walked in carrying a folder filled with documents that represented nearly 50 years of my family's history. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with printer paper filled the air, and the quiet conversations around the room stopped the moment people saw me enter. Victoria Harrington was already standing at the front, holding her familiar leather clipboard. She looked confident, almost relieved, like she believed this meeting would end the same way every other conversation had ended. With her in control. "Thank you for coming, Nathan," she said. "We are here to resolve your continued refusal to follow community regulations." I placed my folder on the table and looked around the room. Many of the residents were people I had known for years. Some waved politely. Others avoided eye contact. I understood why. When someone presents themselves as the authority figure, People often assume they must have earned that position. But that assumption was exactly what created this entire situation. Victoria began explaining how the lake had been treated as a shared community resource for years. She talked about protecting neighborhood traditions, maintaining standards, and preserving property values. Every sentence sounded carefully prepared. Then she displayed a large image of the lake on a screen behind her. "This area has always served the Silver Creek community," she said. That was when I opened my folder. I placed the first document on the table, the original property survey, then the county records, then the boundary map. The room became quiet. Not dramatic movie silence. Real silence. The kind where people stop moving because they are trying to understand something they did not expect. Victoria looked down at the papers, then back at me. "These documents do not change the way the community has used the lake," she said. I nodded. "You are right about one thing. The community has used the lake. But use is not ownership." I could see some residents looking at the documents more closely. They were not taking my word for anything. They were reading the facts themselves. That was all I wanted. I did not want people to choose sides. I wanted them to see the truth. Then I showed the county confirmation that the lake was included within my private property boundaries. I showed the records proving there had never been a transfer of ownership. I showed the timeline of the signs, the fees, and the rules the homeowners association created without legal authority over the water. Victoria's expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. The confidence was still there, but something underneath it had disappeared. For years, she had relied on people assuming she was right. But now the documents were sitting in front of everyone. "Nathan," she said carefully, "we have always believed this was part of the community." I looked at the old map on the table and thought about my grandfather standing beside that same lake decades earlier. "I understand that," I replied. "But belief does not change property lines." Those words stayed in the room. The meeting continued for another hour, but the outcome was already clear. The conversation had changed. It was no longer about whether I should follow HOA rules. It was about why the HOA had been creating rules over something it never owned. By the time I walked outside, the evening air smelled like pine and rain. The lake was calm, reflecting the fading sunlight. For the first time in months, I felt like my grandfather's promise to protect this land had finally been honored. Victoria Harrington came to that meeting expecting me to defend myself. Instead, she had to explain why her authority existed in the first place. And for the first time, she did not have an answer. The days after the meeting felt different. The lake was the same. The trees were the same. The old wooden dock still made the same quiet creaking sound every time I stepped onto it. But something had changed. The story Victoria Harrington had spent years telling was finally being replaced by the truth. Within a week, the Silver Creek Homeowners Association sent an official notice acknowledging that the lake was located within my private property boundaries. The same organization that once sent me an $825 fine for fishing had now removed the restrictions they created. The signs near the shoreline were taken down. The access rules disappeared. The paperwork that once made people believe the HOA controlled the water was no longer there. I remember standing near the lake that morning, holding one of those old signs before it was removed. The metal frame was cold in my hands. The paint smelled fresh, almost like it had been placed there yesterday. It was strange looking at something that had caused so much confusion for so long. It was just a sign, a piece of metal and paint. But for months, it represented something much bigger. It represented what happens when people stop questioning authority. Victoria Harrington did not lose because I was louder than her. She did not lose because I had more influence. She lost because the facts were stronger than the assumption she built everything on. A few weeks later, I repaired the old dock. I replaced some damaged boards, tightened the bolts, and restored the place my grandfather created nearly 50 years earlier. The smell of fresh cut wood filled the air, and for a moment, I felt like I was standing beside him again. I could almost hear his voice reminding me that land was never just about ownership. It was about taking care of something that would outlast you. Some of the neighbors who had stayed quiet during the dispute eventually came by to talk. Many admitted they never saw the original documents. They simply trusted the HOA because the information always came from one direction. That was the biggest lesson from everything that happened. Rules are important. Communities are important. But neither one works without honesty. A title does not create authority. A position does not create ownership. And confidence does not create truth. Victoria eventually stepped away from her role as HOA president after the board reviewed how the lake decisions had been handled. The community moved forward, but this time with more transparency and more questions. As for me, I still spend mornings by the water. I still fish from the same dock where my grandfather taught me patience. The difference is that now I do it knowing the truth is no longer hidden in an old filing box. It is written in the records. It is marked on the map. It is part of the land itself. Looking across the lake at sunset, watching the reflection of the trees move across the water, I think about how close I came to accepting someone else's version of reality. Victoria thought she controlled the lake because everyone around her accepted the story. But the truth was always there, waiting for someone to look closer. And that is something I will never forget. Justice does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives quietly, carried by old documents, patient research, and the courage to ask one simple question: who actually has the right to decide?